Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and every gas station in America has a sign on the pump that reads, "Out of service," not because of a storm, not because of a labor strike, but because a body of water 21 miles wide, a stretch of ocean that most Americans could not find on a map, has just been sealed shut by a country that has nothing left to lose. That is not a hypothetical scenario designed to frighten you. That is what is unfolding right now, in real time, as you watch this video. And before we reach the end of this story, you will understand exactly why the next 90 days may determine the economic fate of the entire Western world. Because what happened in the Gulf in the last 48 hours was not just a military escalation. It was the moment the world stopped pretending that the rules still apply. This is not a story about bombs and missiles. Those are just the symptoms. This is a story about power, who holds it, who is losing it, and what desperate men are willing to do when the walls close in on them from every direction at once. This is the story of how the world's most volatile region just crossed every single red line that existed. How six sovereign Gulf nations were simultaneously targeted by the same enemy within a single 24-hour window for the first time in recorded history, and how the consequences of those strikes are now flowing directly into your pension fund, your fuel prices, your grocery bills, and the global financial system that holds the savings of 3 billion people. Together, stay with me, because what Iran did in the final hours of this crisis is something that no analyst, no general, no intelligence chief, and no foreign ministry anywhere on the planet anticipated. That revelation is coming. But first, you need to understand how the world arrived at this exact moment. To truly grasp the velocity and the scale of what just happened, you have to go back to the decision that changed the entire architecture of Middle Eastern geopolitics in a single night. You have to understand that this moment did not arrive suddenly. It was built over years of accelerating pressure, failed diplomacy, broken agreements, and a slow accumulation of red lines that kept getting redrawn further and further back until there was nowhere left to draw them. Every negotiation that collapsed, every sanctions package that failed to change Iranian behavior, every intelligence report warning that the nuclear clock was ticking, all of it was pointing toward a single inevitable conclusion that every serious analyst in Washington, Tel Aviv, London, and Riyadh had been privately acknowledging for years. The question was never whether this moment would come. The question was only when and what the world would look like on the other side of it. The United States, operating in full coordination with Israel, launched Operation Midnight Hammer, a sustained multi-wave strike campaign targeting Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its integrated air defense networks, and the command architecture that had kept the Islamic Republic functioning as a coherent military power for 4 consecutive decades. These strikes were not symbolic gestures. They were not warning shots designed to bring Tehran back to the negotiating table. They were a systematic, methodical, and comprehensive dismantling of everything Iran had built to protect itself. Within 72 hours, Iran's Fordo enrichment facility buried 100 meters underground inside a mountain, hardened against conventional weaponry, considered by Iranian engineers to be invulnerable, had been penetrated. The Natanz complex, which had survived decades of cyber intrusions, covert sabotage operations, and the targeted assassination of its top scientists, was rendered entirely inoperable. American B-2 stealth bombers, carrying the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, a weapon weighing 30,000 pounds designed specifically for deeply buried hardened targets, delivered a message that no diplomatic cable, no sanctions regime, and no United Nations resolution had ever managed to deliver with comparable clarity. The era of Iranian nuclear ambiguity was finished. But here is what the mainstream headlines consistently missed in their coverage of the strikes. The campaign did not only target facilities and infrastructure, it targeted the people who ran those facilities, the scientists, the engineers, the military commanders who managed the integration between Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missile delivery systems. And when those people began to fall, when the institutional knowledge that had taken 30 years to accumulate began disappearing overnight, Iran's entire decision-making architecture started fracturing at the seams. Within 72 hours of the opening strikes, the country that had spent 4 decades projecting regional dominance, funding proxy militias across 7 countries, and positioning itself as the irreplaceable counterweight to American power in the Middle East, was operating without a coherent chain of command. And that, as any serious military strategist will tell you, is precisely when a wounded state becomes its most unpredictable and its most dangerous. The death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had held the Islamic Republic together through wars, through crippling international sanctions, through domestic uprisings, and through the assassinations of some of his most important military commanders, created a vacuum that no institution inside Iran was structurally prepared to fill. Within hours of confirmation, Iran's top security official Ali Larijani appeared on state television to announce the emergency formation of an interim leadership council. His words were carefully chosen. His composure was practiced, but behind the careful language was a message that every government watching understood with absolute clarity. Larijani accused the United States and Israel of attempting to dismantle the Islamic Republic entirely, not weaken it, not negotiate a new arrangement with it, erase it from the map of Middle Eastern power. And in that single broadcast, the world understood that what was coming next from Tehran would not be calibrated, would not be proportional, and would not be designed to de-escalate. It would be designed to inflict maximum pain on everyone within reach before the regime's capacity to inflict pain was extinguished permanently. Now step back for a moment and consider what you are watching unfold from a proper strategic altitude. For decades, Iran operated what security analysts call the Ring of Fire strategy, a carefully constructed network of proxy forces stretching from Lebanon through Syria, through Iraq, and down into Yemen, designed to give Tehran the capability to strike its enemies at distance while maintaining the plausible deniability that had protected it from direct retaliation. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis controlling the Red Sea corridor in Yemen, Shia militia networks embedded throughout Iraq, Hamas operating in Gaza. This entire elaborate architecture of indirect warfare was built on a single foundational assumption: that Iran itself would never be directly and comprehensively struck, that the Americans and the Israelis would always stop short of crossing that threshold. That assumption died on the first night of Operation Midnight Hammer. And the moment that assumption died, the proxy playbook became irrelevant. Iran was not going to fight through intermediaries anymore. Iran was going to fight directly, and it was going to fight everyone it could reach simultaneously. What happened in the hours that followed is something that defense analysts at Qatar University's Gulf Studies Center described in language that sent a visible chill through every foreign ministry in the world. They stated clearly that, for the first time in recorded history, all 6 Gulf Cooperation Council member states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, were targeted by the same actor within a single 24-hour period. All 6, simultaneously. One researcher at the Gulf Studies Center did not choose diplomatic language when describing this moment. She called it, without qualification, the long-standing nightmare scenario that Gulf Arab leaders had spent the better part of 30 years trying to prevent through a combination of diplomacy, deterrent spending, and calculated political appeasement of Tehran. That nightmare had finally materialized, and the world was watching it in real time. Walk through what happened on the ground, city by city, in sequence, because the accumulated scale of these events is almost impossible to comprehend unless you hear them laid out consecutively. In the United Arab Emirates, a country that the world primarily associates with towering luxury, hotels, Formula One street circuits, and the most transited international airport on the planet, the government reported successfully intercepting 165 ballistic missiles, 2 cruise missiles, and 541 separate Iranian drones within a single engagement window. 541 drones targeting one country in one day. To put that number in proper context, Russia's single most devastating drone campaign against Ukraine, the attack that triggered emergency NATO consultations and dominated global headlines for weeks, involved approximately 100 drones. Iran launched more than 5 times that number against the UAE alone, and the UAE was not even the primary strategic target. It was a secondary theater in a simultaneous multi-front operation. In Dubai specifically, the city that has spent 20 years positioning itself as the undisputed financial capital of the emerging world, the city where Russian oligarchs relocated their assets after the Ukraine sanctions regime, where Chinese sovereign wealth funds operate their regional headquarters, where half of all global commodity trading for the Middle East and South Asia is settled. An intercepted Iranian drone caused a fire on the outer facade of the Burj Al Arab Hotel, the most recognizable structure in the Arab world, the sail-shaped architectural icon that appears on more magazine covers and airline advertisements than any other building in the region. The symbolism of that image, of that specific structure flickering with fire, was not accidental, and it was not lost on a single observer worldwide. Iran was sending a message about what it could reach, and at Jebel Ali Port, the largest man-made harbor in the entire world, the logistics facility through which an estimated 80% of Dubai's imports physically move, a berth caught fire after a second failed interception. The port did not close, but the world took note of how close it came. Then came the infrastructure strike that no analyst had modeled and that every technology economist is still trying to fully quantify. 2 Amazon Web Services data centers in the UAE went dark. A 3rd Amazon facility in Bahrain sustained significant damage. These are not servers storing personal photographs or video streaming libraries. These facilities form the critical backbone of cloud computing infrastructure for the entire Middle East and South Asia region. Banking settlement systems, equity, trading platforms, government administrative databases, regional logistics networks coordinating the movement of goods across a dozen countries. all of them running partially or entirely on infrastructure that Iran took offline in a single strike sequence. The facilities remained dark for days after the initial attacks. The full financial implications of that outage are still being calculated by insurance actuaries and central bank risk departments across the region. But it was in Saudi Arabia that the strategic picture became genuinely terrifying for anyone analyzing the global economic implications. Saudi Aramco, by virtually every measure, the single most valuable corporate entity in the history of human civilization, the company whose production decisions effectively set the baseline price for global energy markets, saw its Ras Tanura facility struck. Ras Tanura is not simply any refinery. It is Saudi Arabia's largest and most critical domestic processing plant. It is the facility that takes raw crude oil extracted from the ground and converts it into the refined petroleum products that flow through pipelines to storage terminals to tankers to the ports that supply fuel to the world's industrial economies. When Ras Tanura catches fire and suspends operations, the entire calculus of global energy markets shifts within a single trading session. Crude oil prices did not spike modestly in response. They moved in ways that erased months of Federal Reserve interest rate policy work within hours of the opening bell. The economic reverberations were immediate, global, and severe. And while the fires burned at Ras Tanura, something was developing in Riyadh that added a layer of political complexity the White House had not anticipated. The United States Embassy in Riyadh, the diplomatic nerve center of American power and influence across the Arab world, was struck by 2 Iranian drones. A fire broke out inside the compound. Embassy personnel were evacuated under emergency protocols. The United States government announced the simultaneous closure of its diplomatic missions in both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. President Trump, appearing before cameras in the East Room, made a statement that caused every financial market open at that hour to freeze. The attacks would be met with full retaliation, and the United States would pursue its stated objectives until they were completely and unconditionally achieved. More than 20,000 commercial flights were canceled across the wider region within the following 48 hours, as airlines rerouted away from what had effectively become a military exclusion zone above the Persian Gulf. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that almost no major Western news organization has properly contextualized for its audience. While all of this was happening simultaneously, while Saudi Arabia's air defense batteries were firing continuously, while Dubai's skyline was lit with intercept. Explosions, while data centers went dark and oil refineries burned, while American diplomats evacuated embassies, Qatar did something that fundamentally altered the strategic narrative of this entire conflict. Qatar, the small peninsula nation that hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East, the forward command and control hub for all U.S. Central Command operations across the region, shot down 2 Iranian Sukhoi Su-24 fighter jets that had approached Qatari airspace. Qatar did not request Washington's authorization before acting. Qatar did not convene an emergency cabinet session or issue a public warning. Qatar engaged Iranian military aircraft in direct aerial combat and destroyed them. A nation with a total population smaller than the metropolitan area of Houston entered into direct military confrontation with one of the region's major armed forces. Consider what that action represents, strategically. Qatar has spent 15 years carefully constructing its identity as the indispensable neutral mediator of Middle Eastern politics, the country that maintains diplomatic access to every actor simultaneously, that hosted the Taliban negotiations that ended America's longest war, that brokered multiple Gaza ceasefire agreements, that preserved open communication channels with Tehran, while simultaneously housing American strategic bombers and special operations forces. Qatar's entire value proposition in the international system was built on that carefully maintained neutrality, and in a single military engagement, that neutrality was permanently erased. Qatar is now a combatant state, and if Qatar, the region's most committed practitioner of strategic ambiguity, has been pulled into direct combat, then every remaining buffer that had been keeping this conflict from metastasizing into a full-scale regional war has been systematically eliminated. Here is what you need to understand about the economic chain reaction that was set in motion the moment Iran made the strategic decision to strike all 6 Gulf states within a single operational window. The Gulf Cooperation Council nations are not simply oil exporters sending petroleum to foreign customers. They are the shock absorbers of the entire global financial architecture. Saudi Arabia alone holds over $600 billion in foreign exchange reserves accumulated over decades of oil revenues. The UAE's constellation of sovereign wealth funds, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Mubadala, and ADQ, collectively manage assets exceeding $1.5 trillion. These figures are not merely impressive statistics. These funds are actively invested in American Treasury bonds, in European equity markets and Asian infrastructure projects, in the foundational financial instruments that provide the liquidity keeping global credit markets operational. When the physical infrastructure supporting these economies comes under sustained military attack, the managers of those funds do not maintain passive positions. They begin moving assets to safe harbors. They begin executing hedging strategies at enormous scale. And when sovereign wealth funds of this combined size begin hedging simultaneously, the ripple effects penetrate every corner of the global financial system within hours, not days. The energy dimension of this crisis is where the consequences become most directly relevant to ordinary Americans, and it is the dimension that most news coverage is, systematically failing to explain with adequate depth and clarity. Before we get to the strait itself, consider what energy security actually means in practical terms for a modern economy. Every product on a supermarket shelf was transported there by a vehicle running on petroleum. Every piece of plastic in your home was manufactured from petrochemical feedstocks. Every airline ticket, every shipping container, every agriculture, all product grown with petroleum-derived fertilizer, all of it is downstream of the energy flows that pass through one narrow channel in the Persian Gulf. When that channel is disrupted, the price pressure does not stay inside the energy sector. It radiates outward through every supply chain simultaneously, appearing first as fuel surcharges, then as higher shipping costs, then as higher manufacturing costs, and finally as higher prices on every shelf in every store in every city in the developed world. The transmission mechanism from Hormuz to your household takes weeks, not months. And it has already started. 2 navigable shipping lanes, each measuring only 2 miles in usable width. Through this channel, the Strait of Hormuz, flows approximately 20% of all the oil produced on Earth every single day without interruption. And that figure substantially understates the true strategic exposure because it accounts only for crude oil. When liquefied natural gas is included in the calculation, and Qatar is the world's single largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, the Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 33% of all seaborne energy trade on the planet through those 2 narrow corridors every 24 hours. Iran has now sealed that strait. This is not a threat being issued from a position of diminishing strength. Iranian naval assets and coastal defense systems have been deployed to enforce a physical closure of the most strategically important body of water on Earth. The last time Iran merely threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz in 2012, crude oil prices spiked 14% within a single week, and the United States Fifth Fleet moved to its highest operational readiness level. What is occurring now is not a threat. It is an implemented closure backed by military force, and the implications for energy prices, for inflation trajectories, for global supply chains, and for the economic recovery programs that every major government has been running since the pandemic disruption are of a magnitude that no economic model has been calibrated to fully capture in real time. Consider specifically what this means for the United States and its closest allies. America has achieved genuine energy independence in terms of crude production through its shale revolution. American shale output has made the United States the world's largest oil producer by volume. But energy independence in production is not equivalent to economic isolation from global energy markets. American refineries, particularly along the Gulf Coast, are physically configured to process specific grades of crude that are partially sourced from the Middle East. More critically, America's most important strategic allies in Europe and Asia, economies whose health is deeply integrated with American financial stability, are critically dependent on Persian Gulf energy flows. Japan imports more than 90% of its petroleum from the Middle East. South Korea imports more than 70%. India, the world's 3rd largest oil consumer and the country that Washington has invested a decade of diplomatic capital in pulling into its strategic orbit as a counterweight to China, sources nearly half of its crude from Gulf producers. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, these countries do not simply identify alternative suppliers overnight. The global energy infrastructure does not reconfigure itself on a short timeline. Alternative supply relationships, new pipeline routes, expanded refinery capacity, these adjustments operate on timescales measured in years and decades. In the near term, the economic pain is immediate, it is severe, and it transmits directly into inflation levels, into central bank interest rate decisions, into the cost of every product whose manufacturing or transportation depends on petroleum-derived energy, which, in a modern industrial economy, means nearly everything that ordinary people buy. Now, look at the broader strategic picture emerging from this crisis, because embedded inside this immediate catastrophe are the seeds of a fundamental realignment in global power that will shape the next 20 years in ways most people are not yet discussing. Russia, which had maintained a complex and frequently contradictory relationship with Iran for decades, cooperating on energy deals, on weapon system transfers, on coordinated strategic pressure against American influence, has been conspicuously absent from this crisis, not diplomatically cautious in its public statements while quietly offering material support. Absent. Moscow has not mobilized any serious diplomatic intervention, It has not moved assets or repositioned forces to signal solidarity with Tehran. It has not issued the kind of aggressive counter-messaging that characterized Russian responses to previous American military actions in the Middle East region. Russia, at the precise moment of Iran's maximum vulnerability, has effectively withdrawn from the field. That strategic abandonment, and there is no other accurate word for it, communicates something important about where Moscow calculates its interests in whatever Middle Eastern order emerges from the wreckage of the current one. China's calculation is equally revealing for what it communicates about the limits of the anti-American coalition that many analysts had been describing as a cohesive strategic bloc. Beijing is Iran's largest trading partner by volume. Chinese companies have been the primary purchasers of Iranian crude oil sold in deliberate defiance of American sanctions. The Belt and Road Initiative explicitly included Iran as a foundational partner in China's vision of a Eurasian economic architecture that would reduce dependence on American-dominated maritime trade routes. And yet China, observing Iran's military capacity being systematically dismantled and its nuclear program physically destroyed, has responded with precisely calibrated diplomatic language that amounts to strategic passivity, calls for restraint, expressions of concern, invitations to dialogue. China will not intervene militarily. China will not rupture its most important economic relationship to rescue an Iranian government whose institutional structure is fracturing and whose military capacity has been substantially degraded. What China is doing instead is more calculated and more consequential than intervention. It is positioning itself to be the primary economic partner of whatever governing structure emerges from the collapse of the Islamic Republic. Beijing is not mourning Iran. It is quietly preparing to inherit the relationship on better terms. Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking publicly about the American campaign's objectives, was more candid than diplomatic convention typically allows. He stated that the primary goal is to fundamentally change the Iranian regime's mindset, to ensure permanently and verifiably that Iran can never acquire a nuclear weapon. President Trump, asked directly whether the campaign had a defined endpoint, said simply that the strikes would continue until all objectives were fully met. Parse those statements carefully. Fundamentally change the regime's mindset. All objectives met. These are not the words of a government executing a limited strike campaign to degrade a specific weapons facility and send a deterrence message. These are the words of a government that has decided the Islamic Republic of Iran, as a functioning political entity controlling a major regional military power, must cease to exist in its current form. That is where the analysis becomes genuinely consequential from a historical and strategic perspective. The United States has attempted coercive regime change in the Middle East before. The outcomes of those attempts are fully recorded in history. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. In each instance, the removal of the central governing authority produced not the anticipated transition to stability and representative governance, but a vacuum. And into every one of those vacuums flowed armed factions competing for territorial control, regional powers intervening to advance their own interests, humanitarian catastrophe at scale, and eventually new security threats more difficult to manage and more expensive to counter than the regimes that had been removed. Iran is categorically not Iraq. Iran has a population of 85 million people. It has a sophisticated and educated middle class that carries no ideological attachment to the Islamic Republic, but also has no institutional framework for democratic transition, pre-positioned and ready to assume governing authority. And Iran, in the process of regime collapse, does not simply transform into a stable, pro-American democracy within a manageable timeline. It becomes a massive, nuclear-adjacent failed state sharing borders with Iraq, Afghanistan, Turkey, and the volatile Caucasus region. The strategic implications of that scenario make the current military crisis appear comparatively manageable. For the Gulf states, the strategic calculus in this moment is almost unbearably constrained. Defense analysts have stated directly that if Iranian attacks on Gulf infrastructure continue at their current tempo and scale, the Gulf Arab states will inevitably be drawn into launching direct defensive counterstrikes against Iranian territory. The UAE is specifically identified as the most likely actor to cross that threshold because the UAE possesses the military capability, the demonstrated political will, and the economic vulnerability that would eventually make continued defensive passivity intolerable to its leadership. But the moment any Gulf Arab state transitions from defense to offense against Iran, the fundamental narrative of this conflict transforms. It ceases to be an American and Israeli military operation against an Iranian nuclear program. It becomes a comprehensive regional war, and a regional war centered on the Persian Gulf, the geography through which a third of the world's energy flows on any given day, is a scenario that every financial institution, every central bank, every insurance underwriter, and every industrial economy has classified at the highest tier of systemic risk for precisely this reason. The question that portfolio managers, pension fund administrators, sovereign wealth fund directors, and central bank governors are all urgently working through right now in offices from New York to Frankfurt to Singapore to Tokyo is whether the global financial system retains sufficient shock, absorption capacity to survive a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz, combined with sustained attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure and the digital systems that run regional commerce. The honest assessment, based on current sovereign debt levels, current global energy inventory positions, and the current fragility of post-pandemic supply chain infrastructure, is that the system's resilience has clear limits. International Energy Agency emergency strategic reserves were designed to cover disruptions measured in days and short weeks. A Strait of Hormuz closure that extends into months, which is now a credible planning scenario given Iran's stated intentions and the military assets it has positioned to enforce the closure, would exhaust those strategic reserves on a timeline that produces severe economic contractions in the world's most energy import-dependent economies before any alternative supply arrangement could be operationalized. And here is the final dimension of this analysis, the piece that brings the entire strategic picture back to the American household, the American voter, the American family sitting at a kitchen table trying to understand why the world suddenly feels as though it has lurched off its axis. The United States is not solely a military actor in this conflict. It is an economic one. The dollar functions as the world's reserve currency in substantial part because global energy markets are denominated in dollars. The petrodollar system, the structural arrangement established after the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold standard in the 1970s, formalized through strategic agreements with Saudi Arabia, ensuring all oil transactions would settle in American currency, has been the invisible but load-bearing foundation of American economic power for 50 years. Every time a Japanese buyer purchases crude oil from a Saudi tanker, that transaction requires American dollars. Every time an Indian refinery takes delivery of a Kuwaiti shipment, the settlement clears in American dollars. This structural global demand for the American currency has allowed the United States to finance government deficits at interest rates no other sovereign borrower could access, and to project economic influence globally in ways that exceed what any military deployment could achieve alone. The disruption of Gulf energy flows at sufficient scale and duration does not simply affect oil prices. It begins to destabilize the entire architecture of petrodollar recycling that has underwritten American financial dominance for half a century. Saudi Arabia's decades-long willingness to price its petroleum in dollars and reinvest its resulting surpluses in American Treasury instruments is not a matter of pure economic convenience. It is a strategic choice embedded in a security arrangement with the United States, an implicit guarantee that American power would protect Saudi Arabia's ability to produce and export oil. If that security arrangement visibly fails, if Aramco refineries burn, if American embassies evacuate, if Iranian drones reach Riyadh, then the foundational premise of that strategic choice comes under examination in places where it has never been seriously questioned before, not in a sudden dramatic rupture, but in the quiet institutional conversations between finance ministers and sovereign wealth fund directors where alternatives begin to be explored, where previously unthinkable arrangements start to seem worth investigating. And once those conversations begin at sufficient scale, the structural advantage that has underwritten American economic hegemony for 50 years begins its slow erosion. This is why what is unfolding in the Gulf right now is not a regional military conflict with economic side effects. It is a global economic and strategic crisis with a civilizational dimension that most people are only beginning to comprehend. The missiles and the drones are the visible, photographable, broadcastable part of the story, but the deeper story, the one that will still be written about in history books 50 years from now, is the story of the moment the world's most critical energy architecture was challenged at its foundation, and no one could say with confidence whether it would hold. That is the story you are living through right now. And understanding it, truly understanding it at the depth we have just explored together, is the first and most important step toward navigating what comes next, the invisible part, the part that will determine whether your cost of living increases by 8% or 25% over the next 2 years, whether your government can maintain its fiscal commitments, whether the international institutions that have managed global economic stability since 1945 can absorb the structural shock of a fundamentally restructured Middle Eastern energy landscape. That invisible part is what history will record as the true significance of what just happened. Because what Iran did in those final hours, the Hormuz closure, the simultaneous targeting of all 6 Gulf states, the strikes on digital infrastructure, the attack on American diplomatic facilities, was not the desperate act of a government fighting for its survival. It was a deliberate strategic decision to make the cost of its removal so catastrophically high that the rest of the world would be forced to recalculate whether the price of finishing this war was one they were genuinely willing to pay. And that calculation, the terrible, consequential, history-altering, Calculation is what every government on Earth is working through right now. The answer will define this decade, and it is coming faster than anyone is ready for. What you have just heard is not analysis of a situation that peaked and is now receding. It is the opening chapter of a restructuring that will take years to fully resolve. Every government will need to make choices in the coming weeks that will lock in their strategic positioning for the next decade. Every central bank will need to decide how aggressively to respond to the inflationary shock moving through the global system right now. Every energy company, every logistics operator, every manufacturer that depends on predictable supply chains will need to build contingency architectures for a world in which the Strait of Hormuz is no longer guaranteed to be open tomorrow morning. And every ordinary person who watches their fuel bill, their grocery receipt, and their retirement account balance will be living with the downstream consequences of decisions being made in war rooms and cabinet chambers right now, today, in real time. The world that existed before Operation Midnight Hammer was launched is not coming back. The question is not whether the map of Middle Eastern power has been redrawn. It has. The question now is what gets drawn in its place, and whether the powers that initiated this transformation have a coherent plan for what comes next. Based on everything we have just examined together, the honest answer is that no one, not in Washington, not in Tel Aviv, not in Riyadh, not in Beijing, fully knows. And that uncertainty, more than any missile or drone or naval blockade, is the most consequential and most dangerous force at work in the world right now. Keep watching. Keep asking the questions that the mainstream coverage is not asking, because the story that matters most is always the one hiding underneath the one being told. And this story is far from over.